In the quiet town of Maple Hollow, where the sidewalks still remembered every pair of footsteps that had crossed them for 50 years, Eleanor Whitmore sat in her old wooden rocking chair on the front porch of a small white house with pale blue shutters. The evening air smelled faintly of lilacs and rain. Eleanor had lived in that house for nearly 40 years, long enough that the porch boards creaked in familiar places beneath her feet, long enough that the oak tree in the front yard had grown wide enough to shade half the street. At 74 years old, Eleanor Whitmore carried the kind of presence that made people pause when she walked into a room. She was not tall, but she stood with a quiet steadiness that made her seem taller than she was. Her silver hair, thick and soft with natural waves, was gathered loosely into a low bun at the back of her neck, though a few wisps had escaped and curled gently around her temples in the warm evening air. Her face was lined with the kind of wrinkles that come from years of smiling, worrying, and thinking deeply about the world. But her eyes were still remarkably sharp. A deep grey blue that seemed to notice things other people missed. The small details, the uncomfortable truths, the things people hoped would go unnoticed. She wore a soft blue cardigan over a simple white blouse, the sleeves rolled halfway up her forearms as she rocked slowly back and forth in the chair her husband had built for her decades ago. The cardigan hung loosely now. Age had thinned her frame, though not her spirit. On her left hand rested a thin gold wedding band she had never removed, even 9 years after her husband's passing. The porch light above her head flickered softly as the sun began to dip below the oak trees across the street. Eleanor held a cup of chamomile tea in both hands, letting the warmth settle into her fingers while the quiet rhythm of the rocking chair filled the stillness around her. Across the street, children's bicycles lay scattered near a driveway. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked once and then stopped. Maple Hollow was the kind of place where evenings arrived slowly, and Eleanor had grown used to the quiet that came with them. The quiet that settles into a home after the people you love slowly disappear from it. Her husband had been gone 9 winters now. Her sister Margaret. Well, that loss was much newer. Eleanor had been thinking about Margaret all evening, about the way her sister used to laugh when they were children, about the arguments they'd had as adults, about the strange final phone call that still lingered in Eleanor's mind like an unfinished sentence. The phone rang just as the sun slipped behind the oak trees. The sound cut through the quiet porch like a dropped glass. Eleanor stopped rocking. She set her teacup carefully on the small wooden table beside her chair. Then she stood slowly, her movements deliberate but steady, and stepped inside the house to answer the call. She lifted the receiver gently. "Hello," she said. The voice on the other end was calm and professional. "Mrs. Whitmore, this is Daniel Carter from Carter and Lowell Attorneys in Boston. I'm calling regarding your sister, Margaret Whitmore Lane." Eleanor's fingers tightened slightly around the phone. "Yes, there will be a formal reading of her will this Friday morning. Your presence is required." Eleanor frowned. "Required?" "Yes, ma'am. There are specific instructions that must be delivered to you personally." She was quiet for a moment. Margaret had always been the organized one, the meticulous one, the sister who labeled every drawer in her house and balanced her checkbook down to the penny. But required. That felt unusual. Margaret rarely demanded anything. "When should I arrive?" Eleanor asked gently. 10 o'clock, Boston office. Eleanor glanced out through the window toward the darkening street. Boston was nearly 1,000 miles away. "Well," she said softly, "I suppose I'll need to catch a plane." 2 days later, Eleanor Whitmore sat beside her 12-year-old granddaughter Lucy at Gate B14 of the small regional airport. The terminal buzzed softly with the restless energy of travelers moving from one place in their lives to another. Rolling suitcases rattled across the polished floor. Announcements echoed overhead. The scent of coffee drifted through the air from a nearby cafe. Lucy sat next to Eleanor in a molded plastic chair, swinging her legs back and forth, her bright red sneakers tapping lightly against the metal frame. "This place smells weird," Lucy whispered. Eleanor smiled faintly. "That's the smell of airplanes and coffee." Lucy wrinkled her nose. No, it smells like old carpet and nervous people. Eleanor chuckled quietly. That too. Lucy leaned closer, lowering her voice conspiratorially. Grandma, why did Aunt Margaret want you to come all the way to Boston just for a will reading? Eleanor folded her hands neatly in her lap. I don't know yet. Lucy tilted her head thoughtfully. Do you think she left you something important? Eleanor looked across the terminal for a moment before answering. Margaret had always been careful with money, careful with secrets too. I think, Eleanor said slowly, my sister rarely did anything without a reason. Lucy grinned. Like you. Oh no, Eleanor laughed softly. Your grandmother makes plenty of mistakes. Lucy nudged her arm. Mum says you once made a corrupt city inspector cry. Eleanor blinked. Well, that was a misunderstanding. Lucy's eyes widened. Did you really? Eleanor lowered her voice slightly. Sometimes people cry when they're forced to tell the truth. Lucy studied her carefully. You're kind of scary, Grandma. Eleanor squeezed her hand gently. Only when necessary. Just then, a loud commotion erupted near the security checkpoint across the terminal. A man's voice rose sharply. No, that's my bag! Travelers turned. Security officers stepped forward quickly. Lucy leaned forward in her chair, curiosity lighting up her face. What's happening? Eleanor followed her gaze. A middle-aged man stood arguing with a security agent while another officer unzipped a large black suitcase on the inspection table. The contents spilled partly into view. Stacks of paperwork, folders, loose envelopes. The man's voice grew louder. You have no right to search that. The officer remained calm. Sir, the scanner flagged unusual items. We're required to inspect, Lucy whispered excitedly. Grandma, do you think he's a criminal? Eleanor tilted her head slightly, observing the scene with quiet interest. I think he's very nervous. Lucy leaned even closer. How can you tell? Eleanor nodded subtly toward the man's hands. They're shaking. Lucy squinted. They are. And notice how he keeps looking at the exits, Eleanor added. Lucy watched carefully. He does. Lucy's eyes widened suddenly. Grandma, you're like a detective. Eleanor smiled faintly. No, just observant. But then something unexpected happened. As security pulled a thick folder from the suitcase, several documents slipped loose and fluttered across the floor. One sheet slid all the way across the polished tile, stopping near Lucy's feet. Lucy bent down instinctively and picked it up. Excuse me, she started to say, but before she could stand, the man rushed forward suddenly. His voice was sharp now. Give me that! Lucy froze. Eleanor's expression changed instantly, calm but firm. Sir, she said quietly, placing one steady hand on Lucy's shoulder. I believe the officer should see that. The security agent stepped closer. Sir, please step back. The man hesitated, then slowly backed away. Lucy handed the paper to the officer, who glanced down at it. His eyebrows lifted slightly. Thank you, young lady. Lucy sat back down beside Eleanor, her heart pounding a little faster now. Grandma, she whispered. Yes. That man looked really mad. Eleanor nodded. Yes. Lucy glanced toward the security table again. The officers were now quietly speaking into a radio. Did I do something bad? Lucy asked nervously. Eleanor turned toward her and smiled gently. No, sweetheart. Lucy's shoulders relaxed slightly. Then why did everyone look so serious? Eleanor thought for a moment. Then she said softly, because sometimes telling the truth makes people uncomfortable. Lucy considered that carefully. Across the terminal, the man was now being escorted away by two officers. Lucy watched silently. Then she looked back at her grandmother with a new kind of admiration. You're definitely a detective, Grandma. Eleanor laughed quietly. I certainly hope not. Just then, the boarding announcement echoed through the terminal. Flight 318 to Boston is now boarding. Lucy jumped up eagerly. Adventure time. Eleanor stood beside her, adjusting the strap of her small travel bag. But as they walked toward the boarding line, she glanced once more toward the security area. Something about the moment lingered. A small reminder. Truth had a way of surfacing, sometimes unexpectedly, sometimes in the hands of a curious 12-year-old girl. Lucy slipped her hand into Eleanor's. "Grandma?" "Yes." "Do you think Aunt Margaret left us a mystery?" Eleanor looked down at her and smiled. "I think," she said slowly, "we're about to find out." High above the clouds, the airplane moved steadily through the quiet sky. Lucy had fallen asleep against Eleanor's shoulder some time after takeoff, her small hand still loosely wrapped around the sleeve of Eleanor's cardigan. The steady hum of the engines filled the cabin with a low, soothing rhythm. Passengers spoke softly. A flight attendant rolled a cart down the aisle, but Eleanor barely noticed any of it. She sat very still, looking out the window beside her seat. Below them, the clouds stretched endlessly across the sky like a soft white ocean. The sunlight brushed their surface in pale gold. For a moment, it almost looked peaceful enough to forget why she was travelling at all. But Eleanor's thoughts had already drifted backward, back to the final conversation she'd had with her sister, 3 weeks before Margaret died. It had been late evening then, too. Eleanor remembered standing in her kitchen, the old wall clock ticking above the refrigerator while she held the phone between her shoulder and ear. Margaret's voice had sounded tired, not weak. Margaret had never sounded weak, but tired in the way someone sounds when they've been carrying something heavy for a long time. "Ellie," Margaret had said quietly. Eleanor had smiled when she heard the nickname. Margaret was the only person who still used it. "Yes, Maggie?" There had been a pause, not an awkward one, a thoughtful one. Then Margaret had said something unexpected. "Do you remember what Dad used to say about people who hide things?" Eleanor had laughed softly. "Our father said a lot of things about people who hide things." Margaret's voice warmed slightly. "Yes, he did. But the one about secrets." Eleanor leaned against the kitchen counter, thinking. Then she said it slowly. "He used to say secrets are like corks in water." Margaret gave a small approving hum. "That's right. No matter how deep you push them," Eleanor continued, "they eventually float to the surface." There was another quiet pause on the line, but this one felt different, heavier. Margaret finally spoke again. "And when they do, someone has to be brave enough to see them." Eleanor frowned slightly. "Maggie, what's going on?" Margaret hesitated. Then she sighed quietly. "You always did ask the hard questions." "Well, someone had to," Eleanor replied gently. Margaret chuckled faintly. "Yes, you did." Another long pause followed. Eleanor could hear Margaret moving around in the background, the faint rustle of papers, a drawer sliding open. "Maggie," Eleanor said softly. Margaret's voice lowered slightly. "Ellie, if something happened to me, would you promise to listen carefully during the reading of my will?" Eleanor straightened a little. "That's a strange thing to ask." "I know. Are you sick?" "No." "Are you in trouble?" Margaret exhaled slowly. "Not exactly." Eleanor waited. She knew her sister well enough not to rush her. Margaret had always spoken carefully when something serious was on her mind. Finally, Margaret said something that Eleanor would not fully understand until much later. "There are things in my house that don't belong to me." Eleanor frowned. "What do you mean?" "Papers," Margaret said quietly. "Accounts. Transactions." Eleanor's voice sharpened slightly. "Maggie, are you saying Thomas—" Margaret interrupted gently. "I'm saying I found things I wasn't supposed to find." Silence settled between them again, the kind of silence that carries truth inside it. Eleanor spoke slowly. "Did you confront him?" Margaret let out a soft breath. "Yes." "And?" "At first he said it was temporary." "Temporary?" He said he'd made some risky financial decisions. Eleanor's brow furrowed. What kind of decisions? The kind that disappear money, Margaret replied quietly. Eleanor felt a chill run through her. Maggie. Margaret's voice softened then. You always were the one who saw through people. That's because you always trusted them, Eleanor answered gently. Margaret laughed quietly at that. Yes, I suppose I did. Then her voice grew serious again. But this time, Ellie, I need you to see what I've seen. Eleanor leaned forward slightly, gripping the phone tighter. Why me? Margaret answered immediately. Because you're the only person I trust to finish something when it started. Eleanor didn't like the sound of that. Maggie, what exactly are you planning? Margaret hesitated again. Then she said quietly, I'm making sure the truth doesn't get buried with me. Eleanor's voice softened. You think it might? Margaret didn't answer that directly. Instead, she said something else. Do you remember the summer we spent at the lake when we were kids? Eleanor smiled faintly. You pushed me off the dock. You were hogging the fishing pole. You nearly drowned me. Margaret laughed softly. You floated. Eleanor leaned against the counter. That's because Dad jumped in. No, Margaret corrected gently. You floated because corks always float. The memory hung between them. Then Margaret said something that Eleanor would replay many times after her sister's death. If anything happens to me, promise you'll watch carefully during the will reading. Watch what? The room, Margaret replied. People reveal themselves when they think they've already won. Eleanor went quiet. Then she said softly, You really think something that serious is happening? Margaret's answer came in a whisper. I know it is. The memory faded slowly as Eleanor blinked and looked back out the airplane window. 30,000 feet below them, the world moved quietly beneath the clouds. Lucy stirred slightly beside her, but remained asleep. Eleanor rested her head gently against the seat. Margaret had known something serious enough to plan for even after her death. And now Eleanor was flying toward the answer. She glanced down at Lucy. The child looked peaceful, trusting. Eleanor placed a soft hand over her granddaughter's. Then she whispered quietly to herself, Well, Maggie, I'm listening. And somewhere ahead of them, waiting in a Boston law office. The truth Margaret had hidden so carefully was about to surface. Because secrets, no matter how carefully they're buried, always float. Boston smelled different from Maple Hollow, colder, sharper, like a city that moved too quickly to notice small details. Eleanor and Lucy stepped out of the taxi in front of a tall brick building overlooking the harbour. The wind carried the scent of salt water and traffic as they entered the polished marble lobby. Lucy whispered as they walked toward the elevator. Everything here feels expensive. Eleanor smiled faintly. That's usually the goal. The elevator ride was quiet, except for the low hum of machinery as it carried them to the 12th floor. When the doors opened, a receptionist directed them down a long hallway lined with dark wooden doors and framed legal certificates. At the end of the hall waited a conference room. The door was already open. Inside, 3 people sat around a large walnut table. A tall man stood near the window, staring out at the grey harbour beyond the glass. Lucy leaned closer to Eleanor and whispered, He looks mean. Eleanor didn't answer right away. She recognised him immediately. Thomas Lane, Margaret's husband, or rather, her widower. He had aged since Eleanor last saw him at the funeral. His hair had thinned slightly, and the sharp lines of his face seemed deeper now. But the thing Eleanor noticed most was his posture, rigid, defensive, like a man bracing for something unpleasant. When he heard the door open, he turned slowly. His eyes settled on Eleanor. Well, he said flatly. Eleanor. There was no warmth in his voice, only impatience. Eleanor nodded politely. Thomas. Lucy stood quietly beside her, studying him with the blunt curiosity only a 12-year-old could manage. Thomas's gaze shifted to the girl. "And who's this?" he asked. "My granddaughter," Eleanor replied calmly. Lucy raised her hand in a small wave. "Hi." Thomas gave a brief nod that felt more like a dismissal than a greeting. The lawyer, a thin man with nervous eyes and silver-rimmed glasses, gestured toward the table. "Mrs. Whitmore, please have a seat." Eleanor and Lucy sat down across from Thomas. For a moment, no one spoke. Thomas broke the silence first. "So," he said, leaning back in his chair, "you flew all the way here for this?" Eleanor folded her hands neatly in front of her. "The lawyer said my presence was required." Thomas snorted quietly. "Yes, Margaret always did enjoy unnecessary drama." Lucy glanced up at Eleanor, sensing the tension. Eleanor's expression remained calm. "My sister wasn't dramatic," she said softly. "She was careful." Thomas shrugged. "Well, careful or not, this reading shouldn't take long." He tapped his watch. "I have meetings this afternoon." Eleanor tilted her head slightly. "That seems quick." Thomas's eyes narrowed. "What does?" "Your willingness to move on," Eleanor replied gently. A flicker of irritation crossed his face. "My wife passed away 3 months ago, Eleanor. Grief doesn't stop business." Lucy shifted in her chair. Something about the way he said it made the room feel colder. Eleanor watched him quietly. "Maggie loved that house," she said. Thomas waved a hand dismissively. "She loved many things." The answer felt too casual, too rehearsed. Lucy leaned closer to Eleanor and whispered softly, "He talks about her like she was a neighbour." Eleanor squeezed Lucy's hand gently. Thomas noticed the gesture. "What?" he said sharply. "Nothing," Eleanor replied calmly. Thomas leaned forward now, studying her carefully. "You always did have that look." "What look?" Eleanor asked. "The one where you think you figured something out?" Eleanor smiled faintly. "I usually wait until I actually have." Thomas chuckled, though the sound carried an edge. "Well, I hope you're not expecting anything surprising today." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "Why?" "Because Margaret already told me what's in the will," he said. The lawyer shifted slightly in his chair. "That isn't entirely accurate." Thomas waved him off. "It's straightforward," he continued. "House goes to me, accounts get divided, charities get their little pieces." He leaned back again, crossing his arms confidently. "Nothing complicated." Lucy looked between the two adults. "Then why did Grandma have to come?" Thomas opened his mouth to answer, but the lawyer spoke first. "Because Mrs. Whitmore Lane left very specific instructions." Thomas frowned. "What instructions?" The lawyer cleared his throat nervously. "She insisted that her sister be present for a particular section of the reading." Thomas's jaw tightened slightly. "That's unnecessary." Eleanor watched him carefully. Margaret rarely did unnecessary things. Thomas met her gaze. "And you think this is some kind of mystery?" Eleanor's voice remained calm. "I think my sister knew exactly what she was doing." The room fell quiet. Thomas stared at her for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then he leaned forward again, lowering his voice. "Let me give you some advice, Eleanor." Eleanor waited. "Whatever you think Margaret told you," he said quietly, "it's probably a misunderstanding." Lucy looked up sharply. Eleanor remained composed. "Why would you assume that?" Thomas smiled thinly. "Because grief makes people imagine things." Lucy frowned. "Grandma doesn't imagine things." Thomas ignored her. He looked only at Eleanor. "You've always had a habit of over-analyzing." Eleanor tilted her head slightly. "And you've always had a habit of dismissing questions." The tension between them thickened. For a moment it felt as if the entire room was holding its breath. Then the lawyer finally spoke. I think it would be best if we began. Thomas exhaled impatiently. Yes, let's. The lawyer opened the thick folder in front of him. Lucy leaned closer to Eleanor. Grandma, she whispered. Yes, sweetheart. Lucy glanced nervously toward Thomas. He looks like someone who's about to get caught doing something. Eleanor's lips curved into the smallest smile. Yes, she said softly. I believe he does. The lawyer adjusted his glasses. I will now read the final will and testament of Margaret Whitmore Lane. And suddenly, the room felt much smaller. Because somewhere inside that folder, Margaret had left a truth waiting to surface. And Eleanor had the feeling that once it did, nothing in that room would remain the same. The lawyer adjusted his glasses slowly as the room settled into silence. Outside the tall windows, Boston Harbor moved quietly beneath a grey sky. A ferry crossed the water in the distance, its horn echoing faintly through the glass. Inside the conference room, however, the air felt tight, heavy, as if everyone sitting at that walnut table knew something important was about to happen. But no one knew exactly what. Lucy shifted in her chair beside Eleanor, her sneakers brushing softly against the polished floor. The lawyer opened the thick folder in front of him. The papers inside were neatly organized, each section separated by colored tabs. Thank you all for attending, he began carefully. Today we will be reading the final will and testament of Margaret Whitmore Lane. Thomas Lane leaned back in his chair, arms folded across his chest. He wore the confident expression of a man who believed he already knew the outcome. Let's keep this brief, he said casually. The lawyer ignored the comment. He cleared his throat and began reading. To my husband, Thomas Lane, I leave my residence located at 142 Seabrook Drive, along with all furnishings, personal property, and household effects. Thomas nodded slightly, as if confirming what he had already expected. Lucy leaned toward Eleanor and whispered quietly, So far he seems pretty happy. Eleanor said nothing. She simply listened. The lawyer continued, To various charitable organizations close to my heart, I leave the following donations. He read through several small foundations, scholarships, and community programs Margaret had supported over the years. Thomas checked his watch. Eleanor noticed. It was the kind of gesture someone makes when they believe the important part is already over. But then the lawyer stopped. He turned one page very slowly. His expression changed. The room grew still. Thomas frowned. What is it? The lawyer looked up. There is an additional instruction here. Thomas exhaled impatiently. Then read it. The lawyer nodded. In addition to the distributions already mentioned, Margaret Whitmore Lane requested that one sealed document be delivered personally to her sister, Eleanor Whitmore, during this reading. Thomas's head snapped slightly toward Eleanor. What document? The lawyer reached into the folder and carefully removed a thick, sealed envelope. The paper was heavy, old-fashioned. Across the front was written a single word in careful handwriting. Ellie. Eleanor's heart skipped. She knew that handwriting instantly. Lucy leaned closer. Grandma, that's Aunt Margaret's writing. Eleanor nodded slowly. Yes. The lawyer slid the envelope across the table toward her. This was left with very specific instructions, he explained. It was not to be opened until this moment. Thomas leaned forward sharply. That's ridiculous. The lawyer did not respond. Eleanor lifted the envelope gently. Her fingers traced the familiar curve of Margaret's handwriting. For a moment, the room felt very far away. Lucy whispered, Grandma, open it. Eleanor broke the seal carefully. Inside the envelope was a thick stack of documents. Not letters, not photographs. Documents, bank statements, property records, transaction reports. Eleanor pulled the first sheet free. Her eyes scanned the numbers, her brow furrowed. Lucy noticed immediately. What is it? Eleanor did not answer. She turned the page. Another statement, another transfer, another account number. Thomas leaned forward impatiently. Well? Eleanor's breathing slowed slightly. She flipped through several more pages. Then she stopped, her eyes fixed on one particular column of numbers. The room remained silent. Finally, the lawyer spoke softly. Mrs. Whitmore? Eleanor looked up. Her voice was calm, but colder now. These records show money being transferred out of Margaret's accounts. Thomas scoffed. Of course they do. People move money all the time. Eleanor held up one of the pages. Yes, she said, but not like this. Lucy leaned forward to see the paper. Columns of numbers filled the page. Dates, amounts, account names. Eleanor turned the page around so the lawyer could see it. Do you notice the pattern? She asked quietly. The lawyer adjusted his glasses. His expression changed almost immediately. Oh! Thomas frowned. What? Eleanor spoke slowly. These transactions began 4 years ago. She flipped to another page. And they continue almost every month. Thomas laughed nervously. That proves nothing. Eleanor's eyes moved to another document. Then another. Her voice grew firmer. The funds were moved into shell accounts. She lifted another sheet, then transferred again through property investments. Thomas's voice sharpened. You're misreading the paperwork. Eleanor looked directly at him now. No. She slid one final document across the table. This one is particularly clear. The lawyer leaned closer. Lucy watched both adults carefully. What does it say? She asked quietly. The lawyer swallowed. It shows $2 million. Lucy blinked. 2 million? Eleanor nodded slowly. Missing. The word landed heavily in the room. Thomas stood up suddenly. This is absurd. Eleanor turned another page. It's actually very precise. Thomas's face flushed. You don't understand how financial restructuring works. Eleanor lifted one final sheet. And this one lists the controlling account holder. Thomas froze. Let me see that. Eleanor did not move the paper. Instead, she read the name quietly. Thomas Lane. Lucy's eyes widened. The silence that followed felt enormous. Thomas stared at the document, then at Eleanor, then back at the document again. That's not what it looks like. Eleanor folded the page carefully. Actually, she said softly, it's exactly what it looks like. Lucy whispered, Grandma. Eleanor placed the papers back on the table. Then she noticed something else inside the envelope. A smaller folded letter. Margaret's handwriting again. Ellie, if you're reading this, it means he didn't fix it. Eleanor closed her eyes for just a moment. Margaret had known, all along. She opened her eyes again, and across the table, Thomas Lane was no longer leaning comfortably in his chair. Now he looked like a man standing on very thin ice, because the truth Margaret had hidden inside that envelope had finally surfaced, and everyone in the room could see it. For a moment after Eleanor finished reading the financial records, no one in the room spoke. The silence felt thick, uncomfortable. Thomas Lane remained standing beside his chair, his hands pressed against the polished surface of the walnut table. The confidence he had worn earlier was gone. In its place was something far less controlled. Panic. Lucy glanced between the adults, her young mind trying to understand what the documents meant. $2 million. Missing. The lawyer cleared his throat carefully. Mrs. Whitmore, there appears to be another document inside the envelope. Eleanor looked down again. Beneath the financial records lay a smaller folded letter. The paper was thinner, more personal. Margaret's handwriting crossed the front in careful, familiar strokes. Ellie. Eleanor picked it up slowly. Thomas's voice cut sharply through the room. You don't need to read that. Eleanor looked at him calmly. I think I do. Lucy shifted in her chair, sensing the tension growing heavier with each passing second. Eleanor unfolded the letter. Her sister's words filled the page. She began reading aloud. Ellie, if this letter is being opened during the reading of my will, then it means the truth I discovered has finally reached you. Thomas laughed suddenly, a brittle sound. This is ridiculous, Eleanor continued. Last year I began noticing irregular withdrawals from our joint accounts. Thomas's voice rose. Margaret was confused about finances. Eleanor didn't stop. At first, Thomas told me they were temporary transfers for investment opportunities. Thomas slammed his hand on the table. That's exactly what they were. Lucy jumped slightly in her seat. The lawyer shifted uncomfortably. Eleanor read on. But the transfers kept growing larger, and they began moving through accounts I had never seen before. Thomas shook his head violently. You're twisting this. Eleanor's voice remained steady. When I asked for explanations, Thomas became angry. The room grew still. Lucy looked at Thomas now. The anger in his face was impossible to ignore. Eleanor continued reading Margaret's letter. He told me I was overreacting, that I should trust him. Thomas let out a bitter laugh. She always was dramatic. Eleanor turned to the next line. But when I continued asking questions, he told me something I will never forget. Thomas's voice dropped into a low warning. Eleanor. Eleanor looked up. What did he say, Thomas? Thomas stared at her. For a moment, the room felt like it might explode. Then Eleanor read the next sentence. He told me some secrets are better left buried, Lucy whispered quietly. That doesn't sound good. Eleanor finished the paragraph. I realized then that the man I had trusted for 20 years was capable of things I never imagined. Thomas's composure finally began to crack. You're reading a private letter out of context. Eleanor ignored him. She continued. I confronted him again the night before I began organizing these documents. Thomas's breathing grew louder now. Eleanor's voice softened slightly as she read Margaret's next words. That conversation became heated. Thomas pointed a finger across the table. This is defamation. Eleanor read on. He said if I exposed him, everything he had built would collapse. Thomas shouted suddenly, because it would have. Lucy flinched. Eleanor lowered the paper slightly. Thomas's chest rose and fell rapidly. You think this town knows how money works? He continued angrily. You think they understand investment risks? The lawyer spoke quietly. Mr. Lane. But Thomas wasn't listening anymore. Eleanor returned her eyes to the letter. Margaret's final paragraphs waited on the page. If anything happens to me, Ellie, please understand that I did not intend to die quietly. Thomas froze. Eleanor continued. If you are reading this, it means Thomas believed my questions would stop once I was gone. Thomas slammed both hands on the table again. That's enough! His voice echoed against the walls. Lucy's eyes widened. Eleanor looked up slowly. You seem very nervous about Margaret's words. Thomas's face had gone pale. You don't know what you're talking about. Eleanor lifted the final page. Perhaps you'd like to explain this part then? Thomas stared at her. Explain what? Eleanor read Margaret's final sentence aloud. The night I confronted Thomas about the missing money, he told me accidents happen to people who dig too deeply. The room fell completely silent. Even Lucy stopped breathing for a moment. Thomas's face twisted with frustration. Oh, for God's sake, he snapped. She slipped. The words burst out before he could stop them. The room froze. The lawyer blinked slowly. What did you say? Thomas's eyes widened as realization crashed into him. He had spoken too quickly. Too loudly. Lucy whispered, Grandma, what does he mean? Eleanor's voice was quiet, careful. You said she slipped. Thomas shook his head rapidly. That's not what I meant. The lawyer leaned forward. Mr. Lane, Margaret's death was ruled an accidental fall down the staircase. Thomas's breathing grew ragged. That's right. Eleanor watched him carefully. How did you know it was the staircase? Thomas froze. The lawyer frowned. The report did not specify that publicly. Lucy looked back and forth between them. Thomas tried to recover. I lived there. Eleanor tilted her head slightly. But Margaret wrote this letter before she died. Thomas's voice cracked. She was emotional. Eleanor leaned forward slightly. And you just said she slipped. Thomas's composure shattered completely. You don't understand, he shouted. Lucy jumped again. She pushed me, Thomas yelled wildly. She grabbed the railing and tried to stop me from leaving. The room went silent. Thomas's chest heaved, and then he realized what he had just said. The lawyer slowly removed his glasses. You said she tried to stop you. Thomas's eyes darted around the room. No, Eleanor spoke softly. Yes. Thomas's voice dropped to a whisper. It was an accident. Lucy clutched Eleanor's arm. The lawyer stood slowly. Mr. Lane, I believe this conversation needs to end immediately. Thomas stepped back from the table, but it was too late. Margaret's final message had done exactly what she intended. It had forced the truth into the open. And Thomas Lane had just revealed far more than he ever meant to. The silence inside the lawyer's office no longer felt calm. It felt heavy, like the air itself had thickened. The faint ticking of the antique clock on the wall suddenly sounded louder than anything else in the room. Tick, tick, tick. Eleanor Whitmore sat perfectly still, Margaret's letter trembling slightly in her hands. Across the polished wooden desk, Thomas Grady no longer looked like the composed lawyer he had pretended to be. His face had drained of colour. Sweat beaded along his hairline. His fingers gripped the edge of the desk so tightly the knuckles turned white. For several seconds, no one spoke. But Eleanor's mind was racing. She replayed the words Thomas had just shouted. She wasn't supposed to be at the lake that night. Those words, those exact words. They echoed in her mind like a bell ringing in a silent church. Eleanor slowly lifted her eyes toward him. Her voice was calm, too calm. But beneath it was a steel edge that made the temperature in the room feel colder. The lake, Eleanor said quietly. Thomas blinked. What? You just said she wasn't supposed to be at the lake. Thomas opened his mouth, closed it. His chest rose and fell faster now. Eleanor leaned forward slightly. And that's interesting, she continued softly. Because until this moment, no one here has mentioned the lake. The room went completely still. Thomas's breathing became audible. Lucy shifted in her chair beside Eleanor, her young eyes moving between the two adults. Thomas shook his head quickly. You're twisting my words. But his voice was cracking now. Eleanor slowly placed Margaret's letter down on the desk. Then she folded her hands, the way Margaret used to do when she was about to say something that would change everything. You told the police it was an accident, Eleanor said quietly. A fall on the back steps. Thomas swallowed hard. Yes, that's what everyone believed. Thomas nodded too quickly. Yes, but Eleanor's voice sharpened now. Then why did you say lake? Thomas froze. The silence stretched so long, the ticking clock sounded like hammer strikes. Tick, tick, tick. Thomas suddenly stood up from his chair, his composure shattered completely. You don't understand, he snapped. The outburst echoed against the walls. Lucy flinched slightly. Eleanor didn't move. Thomas ran a hand through his hair, pacing behind the desk like a trapped animal. She was supposed to stay out of it, he muttered. Eleanor's eyes narrowed. Out of what? Thomas turned toward her, and for the first time since Eleanor had entered the office, his mask slipped completely. You think she was some innocent old woman, he snapped. She knew exactly what she was doing. Lucy's small voice broke the tension like a glass shattering. My grandma wasn't doing anything wrong. The room fell silent again. Thomas looked down at the girl. Lucy was sitting straighter now, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her eyes shining, but fearless. She told me something, Lucy continued softly. Thomas's brow furrowed. What? Lucy looked at Eleanor, then back at him. She said that sometimes grown-ups make bad choices because they think no one will notice. Her voice trembled slightly. But she said the truth is patient. Eleanor felt her throat tighten. Lucy continued. And she said the truth waits. Lucy paused. The room seemed to lean toward her. Until someone brave enough is willing to hear it. Thomas's breathing became uneven. Lucy tilted her head slightly. Then she asked the question that broke everything. So why were you at the lake that night? The words hung in the air. Thomas opened his mouth, closed it. His eyes darted toward the desk, toward the folder of financial records Margaret had hidden, then back to Eleanor. His shoulders sagged, and suddenly the anger drained out of him. She followed me, he muttered. Eleanor's heart skipped. What? Thomas laughed bitterly. She followed me to the lake house. His voice sounded hollow now. She had the records. Eleanor's pulse pounded in her ears. And when she confronted you? Eleanor asked quietly. Thomas's eyes dropped to the floor. She said she was going to expose everything. His voice cracked. She said the town deserved the truth. Lucy leaned forward slightly. What happened then? Thomas closed his eyes. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, finally, she slipped. The words sounded thin. Even he didn't believe them. Eleanor's voice became ice. No. Thomas looked up. You pushed her. Thomas's face twisted. I didn't mean to. The confession burst out of him like a dam breaking. She grabbed my arm. I tried to pull away. His voice rose to a desperate shout. She fell. I swear I didn't mean... The office door suddenly opened. 2 uniformed officers stepped inside. Behind them stood another man Eleanor recognized immediately, Detective Raymond Carter, the same detective who had investigated Margaret's accident. He had been silent the entire time outside the door, listening, recording. Detective Carter stepped forward slowly. His voice was calm. Thomas Grady, he said, you are under arrest for the murder of Margaret Whitmore. Thomas's legs nearly gave out beneath him. The officers moved forward. Handcuffs clicked. Cold metal closing around his wrists. As they began leading him toward the door, Thomas looked back at Eleanor, his expression desperate. I didn't mean to kill her. Eleanor stood slowly. Her voice carried the quiet weight of every year Margaret had fought for the truth. You didn't just kill her, Eleanor said. You tried to bury her voice. Thomas stared at her. Eleanor lifted Margaret's letter from the desk. But she buried the truth where you could never reach it. The officers led Thomas out of the room. The door closed behind them. Silence returned. Lucy slid her small hand into Eleanor's. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Grandma Margaret knew you'd finish it. Eleanor looked down at the girl, her eyes filled with tears. Then Lucy said one final line that would echo long after the story ended. If people like her stop telling the truth. Lucy squeezed Eleanor's hand. Then people like him win. Eleanor pulled her granddaughter gently into an embrace. And for the first time since arriving in that office, the truth no longer felt hidden. It felt free. The late afternoon sun hung low over Willow Creek when Eleanor Whitmore and her granddaughter Lucy finally arrived home. The small town looked exactly the way Eleanor remembered it. The same quiet streets, the same maple trees lining the sidewalks, the same white church steeple rising above the rooftops like a patient guardian watching over the town. But somehow, everything felt different now, because the truth had finally been spoken. Eleanor parked the car slowly in front of Margaret's old house. The familiar porch came into view, its wooden railing still painted the soft pale blue Margaret had always loved. The rocking chair was still there too, empty, gently swaying in the warm breeze. For a moment, Eleanor couldn't move. Her hands rested on the steering wheel as memories flooded back. Margaret sitting in that chair with a cup of tea. Margaret waving to neighbours walking their dogs. Margaret laughing as Lucy chased fireflies across the front yard during summer visits. Lucy unbuckled her seatbelt quietly. "Is this where Grandma Margaret lived?" she asked softly. Eleanor nodded. "Yes." They stepped out of the car together. The air smelled faintly of cut grass and lilacs, and that's when Eleanor noticed something unexpected. Across the front lawn, people were gathering. Neighbours, friends, familiar faces from Willow Creek. Some stood quietly along the sidewalk. Others held small bouquets of flowers. At the edge of the yard, someone had placed a wooden sign into the ground. Eleanor walked toward it slowly. Lucy stayed close beside her. When they reached the sign, Eleanor felt her breath catch. Carved neatly into the wood were the words, "Margaret Whitmore, a voice for the truth." Below, it sat a framed photograph of Margaret. She was smiling in the picture, the same warm, knowing smile Eleanor had grown up with. A small crowd began to move closer. Among them was Detective Raymond Carter. He stepped forward, removing his hat respectfully. "We thought it was only right," he said quietly. Eleanor looked around at the gathering neighbours. "What is this?" Carter gestured toward the porch. "This town owes your sister more than it realized." An older woman Eleanor remembered from childhood stepped forward. "Margaret helped my husband when the bank tried to take our farm," she said. A man near the fence nodded. "She fought the zoning board when they tried to close the public lake." Another voice spoke up. "She helped my daughter get a scholarship." Lucy looked up at Eleanor, surprised. "Grandma Margaret did all that?" Eleanor smiled softly. "Yes." "But she never told anyone," Lucy said. Eleanor shook her head gently. "She didn't need to." Just then the mayor of Willow Creek stepped forward from the crowd. He cleared his throat nervously. "In light of what has come to light," he began carefully, "the town council voted this morning to rename the lake trail." Lucy's eyes widened. "The lake trail." The mayor nodded. He gestured toward another sign being carried toward the yard. Two workers placed it carefully beside the first. The new sign read, "Margaret Whitmore Memorial Trail." Beneath the name were the words, "For the woman who refused to let the truth disappear." The crowd began to clap softly, not loudly, not like a celebration, but like something deeper. Respect, gratitude, remembrance. Lucy squeezed Eleanor's hand. "She really did win," Lucy whispered. Eleanor looked out across the gathering of neighbours, then back at Margaret's photograph. Her voice was quiet, but steady. "She didn't fight to win," Eleanor said. "She fought because it was right." As the sun dipped lower behind the trees, someone stepped onto the porch and placed Margaret's rocking chair beside the front steps. Then, one by one, the townspeople began placing flowers along the porch railing. Red roses, white lilies, wildflowers picked from nearby fields. Lucy tugged gently at Eleanor's sleeve. "Can we put one there too?" Eleanor nodded. They walked together toward the porch. Lucy carefully placed a small yellow daisy beside Margaret's photograph. Then she stepped back and looked at it proudly. Eleanor rested a hand on her granddaughter's shoulder. "Margaret would have liked that," she said. Lucy looked thoughtful for a moment. Then she asked quietly, "Do you think she knew this would happen?" Eleanor looked out across the growing line of flowers, the people sharing stories, the neighbours remembering Margaret's kindness, and she realised something. Margaret had known, not that there would be a sign or a memorial trail, but that the truth, once spoken, would grow roots. Eleanor looked down at Lucy. Her voice was gentle. "I think she knew the truth doesn't disappear," Eleanor said. "It just waits for someone brave enough to keep telling it." Lucy smiled. Then she took Eleanor's hand again. The two of them sat together on the porch steps as the evening sky slowly turned gold. And the rocking chair beside them swayed softly in the breeze, empty, but no longer lonely, because Margaret Whitmore's voice was still being heard. I hope you liked my story. What did you think of it? I want to hear where you are listening from. Leave me a comment below.